Chapter 1. A Visit to the Embassy. Mr. James went out that morning, leaving his young brother-in-law to care for the shop and his wife to care for her brother. The shop was a small dark building on a narrow street in Soho, London. The window displayed photographs of scantily clad dancing girls, mysterious packets, yellow envelopes, bottles of ink, old books, and newspapers. 2 gas lights illuminated the window, though they never burned strongly at night, likely to save money or obscure customers entering the shop. The door remained closed during the day, but was left half open in the evening. Few customers came, usually men in cheap clothes, entering secretively with their faces half hidden by hats and coats. An old cracked bell rang with each arrival, alerting those in the house behind the shop. Mr. James owned both the shop and the house. At the sound of the bell, he usually emerged from the room behind the shop. He was a large man with a dangerous look hidden in his sleepy eyes. Customers handed over money, and he provided the requested items, which were always strangely expensive. Sometimes Mrs. James appeared, a young woman with a full figure, clear skin, and tidy hair. Younger men felt uncomfortable with her, and often bought something unnecessary, like a bottle of ink, which they promptly dropped outside the shop. In the evening, different men came, speaking to Mrs. James in a friendly manner as they passed through the shop into the back room. The shop door was the only entrance to the house where Mr. James lived with his wife Sophia, her brother Stevie, and her mother. Sophia's mother, a fat woman with mobility issues, used to manage a house in Belgravia where gentlemen rented rooms. After her husband's death, Mr. James sometimes rented rooms there. He travelled abroad for business, but his activities were mysterious. When in London, he stayed in bed until late, went out in the evening, and returned in the early morning hours. Sophia brought his breakfast to him in bed, and though pleasant, she spoke little. Mr. James found her pretty, and began conversing more with her mother, who thought him a nice, respectable gentleman. Soon, Mr. James and Sophia married. He revealed his work was political, and required her to be pleasant to his political friends, to which Sophia agreed. They moved to Soho, and Sophia's mother and Stevie joined them. Stevie, though old enough to have a beard, was mentally like a child. He got lost easily, stuttered when worried, and had lost his job as an office boy after exploding fireworks on the stairs, an idea given by other boys. Now he washed plates and cleaned shoes at home with no prospects. Sophia's mother was grateful to Mr. James for caring for her family, especially Stevie, who adored Sophia and would do anything for her. This was the household Mr. James left as he walked to a foreign embassy in Knightsbridge. Dressed in a dark coat and hat, his polished boots, and neatly brushed hair. At the embassy, James showed a special envelope to the porter and proceeded through the garden. Another man opened the door, and James was led to a small room where he waited, standing with his hat and stick. Eventually, a man with an ugly white face and thin grey hair entered, carrying papers. This was Peter, the ambassador's assistant. They did not greet each other. Peter, in a tired voice, expressed displeasure with the police. James, speaking for the first time, noted that every country has its police. Peter demanded something to wake the police up, to which James sighed and then attempted to smile. Peter criticized the softness of the law and people's dissatisfaction, referencing James's reports from the past year. He stated they already knew everything in the reports and wanted something new. James, uncomfortable, promised to try harder. Peter then commented on James's weight, calling him overweight, which angered James. Peter suggested he see Mr. Jason and left James waiting. Chapter 2. Back to the shop. James waited in the little room until a servant arrived to take him upstairs to the first floor. There, he entered a large room where a thin young man with a short beard sat at a big desk. This man, Jason, was the first secretary and spoke in French to Peter, who was leaving. Jason, who was always invited to parties for his good humor and storytelling, looked at James coldly. "You understand French, I suppose?" he asked. James confirmed, mentioning he had lived in France for some years. Jason continued, "How long were you in prison for stealing the plans for that new French gun?" 5 years, replied James. Jason laughed unpleasantly, remarking on James's capture due to a dishonest woman. When asked about his work at the embassy, James explained he had been working for 11 years since Baron Wattenheim was ambassador in Paris. Jason interrupted, criticizing the past generosity of the Secret Service and calling James lazy. He demanded action, mocking James's anarchist affiliations. James, now both angry and worried, listened as Jason insisted they needed to frighten the people with a bold act. Jason suggested planting a bomb under Greenwich Observatory Bondatre. Use that old terrorist, Junt or McCallus, the man who was in prison, Jason instructed. He warned James he wouldn't receive any more money until something happened, questioning James's job. James, feeling hot and uncomfortable, explained, I have a shop. My wife helps me. Your wife? Anarchists don't have wives, Jason retorted coldly. He gave James 1 month to plant the bomb or lose his job, watching through a mirror as the secret agent left the room. James walked back to the shop in an angry daze, barely recalling the journey home. When he arrived, the sound of the cracked bell alerted Sophia, who glanced into the shop to see her husband sitting in the dark. She returned to preparing lunch. James, still unmoving an hour later, joined Sophia for lunch in silence. Stevie, quiet and well-behaved, was watched closely by the 2 women to avoid upsetting James. In the sitting room, a small group of men, including Michaelis, Karl Junt, and Joseph Conrad, talked in front of the fire. Michaelis, who had spent 15 years in prison, had an honest face and smiled often. Junt, still in his coat and hat, enjoyed frightening people with his violent opinions, advocating for death in the service of humanity. Michaelis argued for calm and patience, believing in gradual change without revolution. Conrad, an ex-medical student who wrote for the political group The Future of the Proletariat, listened with an amused expression. The room grew hot, and James opened the kitchen door, where Stevie was quietly drawing circles. Conrad, looking over Stevie's shoulder, remarked, "Those drawings show us that the boy has a criminal mind." "Does he look like a criminal to you?" James asked, finally showing interest. "Yes, just look at his ears," Conrad responded, referencing Lombroso's theories. Yount, overhearing, dismissed Lombroso as foolish, arguing that criminals are made, not born, and blaming societal laws. Stevie, frightened by Junt's angry words, stood at the door with his mouth open. Michaelis reassured him, promoting calm and optimism. As the men continued their discussion, James remained mostly silent, staring into space. Stevie sat in the doorway, distressed by the men's words. When the men eventually left, James closed the door forcefully. Alone, he pondered who would plant Jason's bomb, realizing his own future as a secret agent was in jeopardy. He deemed the men too lazy to help. Junt was cared for by a rich old woman, Michaelis by another wealthy lady, and Conrad lived off young women's generosity. James felt it was different for him. He had to look after Sophia. Before bed, James counted the day's meager earnings, worrying about their livelihood without the embassy's money. Stevie, still in the kitchen, circled the table with a worried expression. James, unsure how to talk to him, suggested, "Why don't you go to bed now?" Stevie didn't respond, so James went upstairs, hearing Sophia's mother talking in her sleep. Another responsibility, he thought angrily. Sophia, woken by James, got up to check on Stevie. James, feeling alone and sorry for himself, imagined Jason's face mocking him in the dark. When Sophia returned, she mentioned Stevie's excitement, but James wasn't interested in discussing Stevie. He complained about his own health, wanting to tell Sophia about the embassy and the bomb, but remained silent about his troubles. Instead, he thought about the men who visited them and how their discussions might be affecting Stevie. Sophia worried about Stevie reading radical stories and becoming agitated, but James remained silent, knowing he wouldn't sleep well that night. Chapter 3. A Bomb in Greenwich Park. The bar, located underground, had a low roof, no windows, and walls adorned with pictures of people drinking and dancing. At one of the 30 small tables sat Joseph Conrad, opposite a dirty little man, calmly drinking from a large glass of beer. This man, known as the professor, had glasses and ears that were too big for his small head. Sitting next to the professor, Conrad felt insignificant. He stared at the professor, trying to extract the information he needed. "Have you been out much today?" Conrad asked finally. "No, I stayed in bed all morning." "Why?" The professor lived far away in a poor part of London, renting a room where mysterious things seemed to happen. His largest piece of furniture was a very large cupboard, which he kept locked at all times. He stayed in his room when his landlady cleaned, and when he went out, he always locked the door and took the key with him. "Have you heard the news?" asked Conrad. The professor shook his head. Conrad waited for a moment and tried again. "Tell me, do you give your explosives to anybody who asks for them?" "Yes." "Why not? Have you ever given any to a detective, for example?" The professor smiled, confident in himself. "The police won't come near me, but they could get the explosives from you and then arrest you." "I don't think so. They know what I always carry with me." The professor touched his coat lightly. "Yes, enough explosive to kill yourself and everyone near you," Conrad said, his voice filled with both wonder and fear. "I always have my hand around the rubber ball inside my pocket. It activates the detonator inside the glass jar. The tube goes up here." He quickly showed the brown rubber tube that disappeared into the inside pocket of his coat. "Does it explode immediately?" "No, it takes 20 seconds from the time I touch the ball." 20 seconds! Conrad couldn't believe it. "That's terrible. It is the weak part of this system. I'm trying to invent something better. A really intelligent detonator." 20 seconds, repeated Conrad, shaking his head. "Nobody in this room could hope to escape," said the little man, looking around him. Conrad shook his head again, picturing the terrible destruction of a bomb in that room. But the professor continued talking calmly. "Other people believe that I will use my bomb. That's what makes me free. They need order and life. I need nothing but death. And that makes me strong." Carl Jund said something like that a short while ago. Carl Jund knows nothing. None of you people know anything. "But what do you want us to do?" asked Conrad angrily. "Invent the perfect detonator. That's what you should be thinking about. You aren't any better than the police. I met Inspector Heat the other day. He was thinking of so many things. His boss, his money, the newspapers, and you and your friends are the same as him. You talk and do nothing. I work 14 hours a day inventing the perfect detonator. If necessary, I eat and I work alone." Conrad's face had gone red. "Let's leave all that. What about the news, eh?" He took a newspaper out of his pocket. "There was a bomb in Greenwich Park this morning at 10:30. It left a big hole in the ground under a tree, and there were pieces of a man's body all over the place. He blew himself up. Did you have anything to do with it?" The professor said, "Yes," almost smiling. "I knew it," cried Conrad. "You give your explosives to the first stupid person that asks." "Right. And why not? I don't take my orders from you. You aren't important enough." "Your detonator wasn't very good this time," said Conrad coldly. "It killed the man." The professor looked a little uncomfortable. "Yes, well, someone has to try them. Can't you describe the person you gave it to?" "I can do more than just describe him. It was James." "James? And—" "Impossible." "Yes. Wasn't he an important man in your group?" "Well, not really. He usually received comrades who were coming to England, but he wasn't really important. He had no ideas. Years ago, he used to speak at meetings in France, I believe, but he didn't do it very well. The police left him alone. I don't know why. He was married, you know. I suppose he started that shop with his wife's money. He seemed to do all right." Conrad paused and spoke almost to himself. "I wonder what that woman will do now." "James told me that he wanted to destroy a building," said the professor. "I gave him a thick glass jar full of explosive inside an old tin. Perhaps he activated the detonator and then forgot the time. He had 20 minutes. Or perhaps he dropped it. The detonator was fine, I'm sure. Conrad was worried. All of this isn't very nice for me, he said, as the professor called the waiter and paid the bill. Carl has been ill in bed for a week, and Michaelis is in the country writing a book. The police might get interested in me. I don't know what happened to James. It's a mystery, said the professor. But he's gone. The police know you did not help him. I'm not so sure. But perhaps our friend Michaelis could support us when he speaks at one of our meetings. Michaelis is stupid, but people like him. And I could talk to a few newspapers. Conrad thought about James's shop in Brett Street. Were the police already there, asking questions? Then he wondered how the police would identify James after the bomb had done its violent work. Perhaps he was safe after all, or perhaps not. What should I do now? He said half to himself. Get what you can from the woman, said the professor, who had heard his words. The little man finished his beer, got up, and walked away from the table. Conrad, surprised at the professor's words, sat alone for a little longer, thinking. When he came out of the bar into the grey, dirty street, the professor had already disappeared. Chapter 4. Chief Inspector Heat. The professor walked along the busy street, feeling the rubber ball in his left pocket and smiling to himself. He left the crowds and turned into a quiet, narrow street. A tall, well-built man, coming towards him, stopped in surprise. This was Chief Inspector Heat of the Special Crime Department, who had not had a good day. Just before 11 o'clock that morning, Heat received news about the bomb in Greenwich. Less than a week before, he had assured a very important person that the anarchists were not planning anything violent. Now he felt foolish. He went to the park and then to the hospital, where he saw what was left of the bomber's body. It was impossible to identify. He talked to the policeman who arrived immediately after the explosion. He's all there, sir. Every bit of him. I heard the bang and felt the ground shake. Then I saw a light through the fog and ran towards the observatory. You used a shovel, said Heat, noticing small stones among the pieces of body. Yes, I had to. Heat felt sick. An old woman saw two men coming out of the station, the policeman continued. One was tall and thin, carrying a tin. The other was fatter. He looked at the body. Well, here's the tall, thin one. I suppose he fell over, and the thing he was carrying exploded. Heat picked up a piece of dark blue cloth with a narrow edge of blue velvet. The old woman noticed that. The policeman added, "A dark blue coat with a velvet collar," she said. Heat looked interestedly at the cloth, quickly pulling it from the collar and putting it in his pocket. Then he threw the piece of velvet back onto the table. "Cover him up," he ordered, and left. On the train back to town, Heat thought about his discovery. He wasn't going to say much about the man who had blown himself up. When he met the professor, he said, "You are not wanted yet. But when I want you, I will know where to find you." Well, if anything happens and we're both blown up, I suppose they will say nice things about you in the newspapers. Just think, they might bury us together, the professor replied. Heat was very angry, but spoke quietly. "I'll get you in the end." "I'm sure you will," said the professor. "But why not now? There's no one near us. It's the perfect chance. Do you think I'm stupid? The law will win in the end. I don't know what your game is. I don't believe you know yourselves. Stop doing it. There are more of us than you." The professor spoke more bravely than he felt. "I am doing my job better than you're doing yours." "That's enough," said Heat quickly. The professor laughed and continued on his way, wanting to return to his lonely room, far from the crowded city. The man's mad, thought Heat as he watched the professor leave. Now he had a more important problem to think about: what to say to his boss, the assistant commissioner. The assistant commissioner was working at his desk when Heat entered the room. He had a foreign-looking face, with dark hair and a dark beard. "Ah, Heat, I suppose you were right when you said the London anarchists had nothing to do with this business. But we need to know who did it. Have you brought anything useful from Greenwich?" Heat explained that he believed two men had taken part in the bombing. One man had shown the other where to put the explosive, and then left. He was probably waiting for the train when the bomb exploded. The assistant commissioner watched Heat as he talked. He did not enjoy his job in London. He had begun working as a policeman abroad and liked it there. But then he married while on holiday in England, and his wife did not want to go abroad. She knew a lot of important people in England, which had helped him. But he hated working at his desk all day and the English weather. "Are you looking for the other man?" he asked. "Yes, sir. The porter at the station in Greenwich remembers them." The fat man was carrying a tin and gave it to the thin young man in the station. "This agrees with what the old woman told the police in Greenwich Park. And I saw bits of tin among the remains of the body." And they caught the train to Greenwich. 2 foreign anarchists going there from that small country station. That's strange. It isn't so strange when you remember that Michaelis is staying in a cottage near the small country station. The assistant commissioner showed more interest in the case upon hearing Michaelis's name. Michaelis was supported by a rich and important lady, one of his wife's best friends. All kinds of people met at her house: kings, queens, artists, men of science, politicians, and even criminals. Years before, Michaelis and some other men had tried to help prisoners escape from the police. The plan failed, and a policeman was killed. Michaelis knew nothing about the shooting, but later he stupidly said he was sorry the plan didn't work. For that, he was sent to prison for life, making him famous. After 15 years, he came out on bail. Even after all the years in prison, he remained optimistic, believing in people's inherent goodness. The assistant commissioner had been there when Michaelis first came to the great lady's house. She liked Michaelis a lot. When he left, she said, "And that is what some people call a revolutionary." A good-time man, and they put him in prison for 15 years. Now his parents and the girl he was going to marry are all dead. Someone will have to look after him. The assistant commissioner secretly agreed. Michaelis was strange, but not dangerous. "If they send that man to prison again, she will never forgive me," he thought. Chapter 5. The assistant commissioner visits Sir Ethelred. The assistant commissioner turned to Heat. "Do you have proof that Michaelis knows about this business?" "Proof, sir?" "Yes, sir. Trust me." Heat laughed as if he had a special secret. "What did you find out at Greenwich?" asked the assistant commissioner. Heat decided to be honest. "I have an address, sir." He showed his boss the piece of blue cloth he had taken from the remains. "This is from the coat worn by the man who blew himself up." The assistant commissioner saw an address handwritten on the cloth in ink: 32 Brett Street. "What's that?" "It's a shop, sir," Heat explained, "about James." "Does anyone else know about James?" "No, sir. A personal friend in the French police told me he was an embassy spy. It was private information." "And how long have you known this spy?" "I first saw him 7 years ago, when some important foreign visitors were on a visit here. Baron Stott-Wattenheim was ambassador then. He sent for me and told me a man had come from Paris with important information. He showed me into a room where a large man was waiting. The light was not good, and I could not see him well. We talked, and he gave me news that probably saved us from serious problems during the visit. I saw the large man, James, again later in the street. One of our detectives watched him for a few days and told me he had married his landlady's daughter. They had gone on holiday, and he saw old Paris labels on their bags. When I went to Paris for work, I spoke to my friend in the police. He told me the man worked with an international group of revolutionaries and was now a secret agent for a foreign embassy in London. I had proof he was the man I saw at Baron Stott-Wattenheim's. One night, I went to his shop and spoke to him. I said the police would leave him alone if he did nothing too bad. This was useful to him because some things he sells have to go through customs at Dover. And what do you get from him in return for not speaking to customs? Our men take careful notice of anyone they see with him. I can always get an address from him. I usually write him an unsigned note, and he answers the same way, sent to my private address. If I think something is going to happen, he can usually tell me something about it. He didn't tell you anything this time. I didn't ask. He isn't one of our men. We don't pay him. No, he's a spy paid by a foreign country. I must be free to work in my own way, sir. There are things that not everyone should know. Not even me, said the assistant commissioner angrily. Heat said nothing, so his boss continued. Is the house watched by the police? Not all the time. I don't think James knows anything about this Greenwich business. No? James? Then how do you explain this? The assistant commissioner looked at the piece of blue cloth lying on the table. I can't explain it, sir. I think the man who knows the most about all this is probably Michaelis. What about the other man who escaped from the park? I think he will be far away by now. Suddenly, the assistant commissioner was in a hurry to end the conversation. He told the chief inspector to meet him early the next morning. Soon after Heat left, his boss put on his hat and left the building, heading to speak with a very important politician, Sir Ethelred, the Home Secretary. He hurried towards the Parliament buildings. Sir Ethelred, a big white-faced man, sat behind a large, almost empty desk. The assistant commissioner, looking small and dark in comparison, explained the situation. Well, Sir Ethelred said, is this the beginning of more problems from the anarchists? I don't think so, sir. Ah? Less than a month ago, I was told that nothing like this was even possible. I am sorry, sir, but it wasn't me who told you that. That's true. It was Heat. You haven't been in the new job long, have you? How are things? I believe I'm learning something new every day, Sir Ethelred. I want to talk to you about the Greenwich bombing. Very well. Go ahead. The assistant commissioner talked for some minutes, and Sir Ethelred listened carefully. So you see, sir, the assistant commissioner concluded. This is special. You are all right to think that the ambassador of a foreign country is doing things like that. Really, these people are impossible. What should we do you think? We shouldn't accept these secret agents, sir. They are dangerous. And perhaps we should take Heat off the job. What? Heat? Not very clear, eh? Said Sir Ethelred, who did not like the chief inspector. I couldn't say that, sir. He's the best in his department. All my information is from him. But I've discovered that Heat has been using James privately, and I don't agree with that. It's a good idea to stop James, but Heat may see this as a personal attack. I believe I can find out what is behind the Greenwich business if I go myself to the shop in Brett Street. Why can't Heat go? Because I want to know the real story behind the bombing. And he just wants to arrest as many well-known anarchists as possible. James will help. Won't find me soon. It won't be difficult to frighten him. Can I tell him he will be safe if he helps us? Of course. Question him and find out as much as you can. Come to Parliament later tonight and tell us what you know. Happily, the assistant commissioner returned to his office, where he changed into a short coat and a low round hat. Then he went into the street. It was dark and raining. He took a cab to a small Italian restaurant, where he sat alone at one of the side tables. Seeing himself in one of the mirrors, he pulled up the collar of his coat to partly cover his thin, dark face. That's better, he thought. Brett Street was not far, and soon the assistant commissioner was walking towards Mr. James's shop. Chapter 6. Sophia's mother moves out. Between James's visit to the embassy and the Greenwich bombing, Sophia's mother decided to move out. She had managed to get a little charity cottage from the people her husband had worked for. Sophia was so surprised when she heard the news that she stopped cleaning the back room and stared at her mother. Why did you want to do that, Mother? Weren't you comfortable enough here? The old woman explained how her husband's friends had helped her to get the house. When the story was finished, Sophia left the room. Her mother was glad there were no more questions. The day before she left Brett Street, she said to Sophia, "Everything I leave here is yours now, my dear." She left nothing for Stevie, believing it best if he had to depend on James. If Stevie had nothing, they couldn't leave him to look after himself. On the day she left, an old cab, pulled by an even older horse, came to take Sophia's mother to her new house. The two women got into the cab, and Stevie climbed onto the box next to the driver. They started their journey through the grey streets. The horse was old and thin, and moved slowly, although the driver whipped it from time to time. Up on the box, Stevie was worried. "You mustn't whip," he stuttered to the driver. "It hurts." The driver looked at him and whipped the horse again, not out of malice, but because it was what he usually did, seeing nothing wrong in it. This was too much for Stevie. He stood up, stuttering more than ever, and jumped down from the box. Shouts came from the street as the driver stopped his cab suddenly. Sophia put her head out of the window, and her mother shouted, "Is the boy hurt?" Stevie was not hurt, but he was excited. "We're too heavy," he stuttered. "Stevie, get up on the box now, and don't try to get down again." Sophia's voice shook a little. "No, I must walk." "Mr. James won't be happy at all about this, Stevie." The name of Sophia's husband calmed Stevie a little. Unhappily, he climbed back onto the box. "Don't do that again, do you hear?" said the driver. He spoke less angrily, realizing Stevie was not like other young men. The cab continued on its way, the only sound being the horse's feet on the hard road. Inside the cab, Sophia said, "You've done what you wanted, Mother, but do you think you'll be happy?" The older woman tried to be optimistic. "I know you'll visit me as often as you can, won't you, dear?" "Of course," said Sophia. "And I must see that poor boy every Sunday." She thought of the journey Stevie now had to make from the shop to her cottage, realizing it was too difficult for him. He had to take 2 buses. She started to cry. "Don't cry, Mother. I can't myself every week, but I'll make sure he doesn't get lost." "Here you are," said the driver. The cab had stopped outside a group of little low cottages. The old woman got out with a key in her hand, and Sophia paid the driver. Stevie helped his mother with her things. Then he came out and stared worriedly at the horse. The driver spoke to him. "Don't worry about the horse, son. What about me, eh? I work until 3 or 4 in the morning. I get cold and hungry, and I've got a wife and 4 children at home. This isn't an easy world." "Bad," agreed Stevie, feeling sorry for both the horse and the driver. He hated the unfairness of it all. The driver walked away, pulling his horse and cab. Stevie watched them go, his mouth open. He was sorry and angry at the same time. When he felt like this, he did not know what to do. Sophia came out of the house and took his arm. "Now, Stevie, you must look after me when we cross the road, and you get onto the bus first, like a good brother." Being a good brother was the most important thing to Stevie. They walked down the poor, badly lit street. The old horse and cab stood outside a pub. "Poor thing," said Sophia, without thinking. Poor," agreed Stevie. "The driver is poor too. He told me himself." "Come on, Stevie. You can't help that." Stevie thought for a while. Bad world for poor people. Nobody can help that. She looked at him with great affection. "Quick, Stevie, stop that green bus." Stevie, feeling important, lifted his arm. The bus stopped, and they got on. An hour later, they arrived home. James was there, reading the newspaper. He stared heavily at his wife but said nothing, showing no interest in what they had done that day. At supper time, Sophia called to her husband as usual, Adolf. Without a word, James came to the table and ate in silence. Sophia noticed the empty place where her mother usually sat, realizing she missed her very much. She looked at her husband. "Are you going out tonight?" James shook his head, but 2 minutes later, he got up and left. He didn't know he could find to plant a bomb at Greenwich Observatory, but the streets and crowded bars held no answers for him. Feeling worse than before, he finally returned home, locking the front door and going straight upstairs. Sophia was already in bed, but not sleeping. James's heavy silence worried her. As usual, when she was worried, she talked about something else. "Mother's done what she wanted to do, but I don't understand it. I don't know what I'm going to do to make Stevie feel happy. He'll be worried about her for days." James got into bed. He wanted to tell his wife everything about his problems with the embassy, but instead said, "I'm going abroad tomorrow. I'll be away for a week or perhaps 2. Will you be all right?" Sophia said, "I shall manage, with Stevie's help." Chapter 7. James takes Stevie with him. After 10 days, James returned from his journey abroad. Looking very tired, he walked heavily into the shop, dropped his bag on the floor, and fell into a chair. Stevie picked up the bag so quickly that James looked at him in surprise. James was not hungry, but didn't refuse the food Sophia put in front of him. In silence, he listened as Sophia told him the news. "Stevie's been difficult to manage, but he's still working hard and helping in the house. He can't do enough for us." At that moment, Stevie picked up James's hat and took it away carefully with the bag into the kitchen. For the second time that day, James was surprised. "You can do anything with that boy, Adolf. He'll go through fire for you if you ask him to," said Sophia, smiling. James spent most of the day sleeping in front of the fire. In the afternoon, he said he was going for a walk. Sophia suggested, "Why don't you take Stevie with you, Adolf?" "Yes, all right. But perhaps he'll walk away from me and get lost in the street." Sophia shook her head. "He won't. And Teddy and shit. You don't know him. That boy thinks too much of you. But don't worry. If he gets lost, he'll soon arrive home safely." "All right," James said, trusting his wife. Sophia watched the 2 men with something like affection as they walked down the street, one short and heavy, the other tall and thin. The cloth of their coats was the same, and their hats were round and black. They could be father and son, she said to herself happily. In the days that followed, James took Stevie out more often, but the boy started talking to himself and seemed angry. Sophia feared he was influenced by her husband's friends. James said Stevie might calm down if he went to stay with Michaelis in the country. Sophia soon agreed. After all, Michaelis was always kind to Stevie, not like some of the others, and he seemed to like the boy. So James took Stevie away the next day. When Sophia told Stevie not to get his clothes dirty in the country, he didn't look at her in his usual trusting way. She smiled at him. "Don't look at me like that. You know, you get very untidy sometimes, Stevie." Some days later, on the evening of the Greenwich bombing, James didn't come back until it was almost dark. Sophia had been alone all day. She was sitting sewing when the cracked bell rang, and James came in with his head down and went straight towards the back room. "What an awful day," said Sophia calmly. "Have you been to see Stevie?" "No, I haven't," said James softly, banging the door shut loudly behind him. Sophia sat still for some time without touching her sewing. Then she got up to light the gas. It was time to make tea. As she went through the back room on her way to the kitchen, she heard a strange rattling noise that made her stop in surprise and fear. James had pulled a chair towards the fireplace and was sitting almost on top of the fire, with his head in his hands. The sound Sophia heard was his teeth rattling violently, and his huge back was shaking. "Where have you been today?" Sophia asked. "Nowhere," answered James in a low, hoarse voice. Then, realizing this was not enough, he added, "I've been to the bank to take out all the money. We may need it soon." "I don't know what you mean." Sophia spoke calmly, but didn't move from where she stood. "You know you can trust me," said James hoarsely. Sophia turned slowly towards the cupboard, saying, "Oh, yes, I can trust you." She put plates, bread, and butter on the table. Remembering her husband had been out all day, and was probably hungry, she went to the cupboard again for cold meat and a carving knife and fork. She called quietly to James, who seemed to be asleep. "Adolf?" James got up and staggered a little before he sat at the table. He didn't touch the meat, but drank 3 cups of tea. His eyes and face were red, and his hair was standing up. Sophia said, "Take your shoes off. Your feet are sure to be wet. And you aren't going out any more this evening." James told Sophia he was thinking of going to live abroad, perhaps to France or California. "What an idea," said Sophia. "You can't be serious. You've got a good business and a comfortable home, and you aren't tired of me." She got up and walked to the other end of the table. Resting on James's shoulder from behind, she kissed his head and waited there for a moment. "Finally," she said, "if you go abroad, you'll have to go without me." She was thinking about Stevie. "And then you'll miss me, so, you know, you couldn't do that." "Of course not," said James in a louder voice. At that moment, the shop bell rang. "Shop, Adolf, you go." James slowly went towards the shop. When he returned a few minutes later, his face had changed from red to white. "I have to go out this evening after all," he said, but didn't move to pick up his coat. Sophia walked into the shop and closed the door behind her. The man waiting there was thin, dark, and looked foreign. He smiled at Sophia, and she said, "If you need somewhere to stay, the Continental Hotel is a good place. My husband will take you there." "A good idea," said the thin man, whose smiling face had suddenly become hard. Sophia returned to the back room and spoke to her husband. "Adolf, that man isn't one of those embassy people, is he?" James jumped in surprise and fear. "Who's been talking to you about embassy people?" "You have, in your sleep. I didn't really understand what you were saying, but I knew something was worrying you." James, red-faced and angry, said, "I could cut their hearts out, but they'll have to be careful. I've got a tongue in my head. Well, get rid of that man and come home to me. You're not well, but before you go, perhaps you should give me the money you took out of the bank." "Oh, yes, yes. Here it is." James gave his wife a wallet full of notes, which she hid inside her dress. Shortly after James left, the cracked bell rang again. This time it was Chief Inspector Heat, who had come for some private information. Sophia told him her husband had gone out. "I think you know who I am. My name is Chief Inspector Heat of the Special Crimes Department. Did your husband say when he would be back?" "He wasn't alone." Sophia described the dark stranger, and Heat recognized the assistant commissioner and sighed. He decided to find out how much Sophia knew. "What do you know about the Greenwich bombing?" Sophia told him she knew nothing. "And there's another thing," said Heat. "I've got a coat here, probably stolen, and I think it came from here. Your address is on it in purple ink." "I see you have a lot of ink here," Heat said, looking at the lines of small bottles ready for someone to buy them. "That's my brother's coat, then. I wrote that address myself. He's been staying with our friend Michalis in the country." Heat almost laughed. "Right. And is your brother a large, heavy man?" "Oh, no, that must be the thief. Stevie's tall and thin." Heat put his hand in his pocket and pulled out a newspaper and a piece of blue cloth. He gave the cloth to Sophia. "I suppose you recognize this?" Sophia's eyes seemed to grow bigger as she took it in her hands. "Yes," she whispered, staggering backwards a little. "But why is it pulled out of the coat like this?" At that moment, Heat began to realize the extraordinary true facts of the Greenwich bombing. James was the other man. Sophia had sat down suddenly and was staring in front of her. She did not look up when the bell rang, and James came in alone. He walked up to Heat, led him into the back room, and closed the door behind them. Sophia ran to the door and fell onto her knees, ear to the keyhole. She could hear Heat's voice clearly. "You are the other man, James." 2 men entered the park. "Then arrest me now." "Oh, no. I know you've been talking to my boss. He'll have to manage this little business all by himself. But just remember, it was me who found out the true story." Sophia heard her husband say, "I never noticed that she had done that." She knew he was looking at the coat label. Now Heat was speaking again. "How did you get away?" "I was walking away when I heard the bomb explode. It came too soon, and I started running through the fog. No one saw me until I was past the end of George Street." Sophia tried to put her ear closer to the keyhole. Her lips were blue, and her hands were as cold as ice. Heat spoke again. "We think he tripped over a tree root. He was blown up into little bits. They had to pick him up with a shovel." Sophia got up and staggered towards the chair. She picked up the newspaper Heat had left earlier and tried to open it, but failed. Finally, she threw it on the floor. On the other side of the door, Heat said, "What made you do it?" "Thinking of Jason," James replied. "A real pig made me do it, a gentleman." Heat opened the door and walked past Sophia into the street. She heard the bell but did not look up. Instead, she put her hands over her face. In the dark little shop, the only brightness came from the gold wedding ring on Sophia's left hand, which shone brightly in the darkness. Chapter 8. The Assistant Commissioner meets Jason. The Assistant Commissioner was driven quickly in a cab from Brett Street to Westminster, where he got out at the entrance to the Houses of Parliament. He was shown immediately into a poorly lit room, where the greenish-coloured lamps gave the feeling of being in a forest. The Home Secretary was sitting behind a large, almost empty desk. Through the green shadows, the Assistant Commissioner could only see a heavy head resting on a large, white hand. He sat down at the other side of the desk. In the green light, he looked darker and more foreign than ever. Sir Ethelred showed no surprise at the other man's early arrival, but he wanted to know the news, and his voice was hard. "Well," he said, "what have you found out?" "James was very quick to tell me everything, sir. His brother-in-law, nothing more than a weak boy, was the person who was killed. Another interesting thing is that I'm sure Michaelis had nothing to do with it, although the boy had been staying with him. It's difficult to believe, but James was terrified of that man, Jason. He thought that he and the other embassy people would destroy his life. I don't think he planned the death of that poor boy, but he completely lost his head." Something moved among the green shadows of the room, and the great man spoke. "What have you done with him?" "I let him go, Sir Ethelred. I don't think he will disappear. He seemed to want to be with his wife. He has to think of the possible danger from his comrades too. How will he explain trying to disappear to them?" The great man, who perhaps had other, more important things to think about, got up heavily. "Tonight, I will discuss what to do with James, and I'll send for you tomorrow morning." He held out his big white hand and shook the thin dark hand of the Assistant Commissioner. He had his information, and the conversation was over. The Assistant Commissioner walked home and changed his clothes. There was time, after all, to visit his wife's friend, the great lady who looked after Michaelis. He was glad. He knew that he was always welcome in her house. When he entered the large and crowded room, he saw his wife talking to a small group of people in the corner. The great lady herself was sitting, talking to a man with a thin face and a short beard. She greeted the Assistant Commissioner warmly. "I never hoped to see you here tonight. Annie told me that you were working." "Yes, I had no idea myself that my work would be over so soon." He spoke in a lower voice. "I'm glad to tell you that Michaelis is out of trouble now." A silence fell. The other man smiled a little, and the lady said, "I don't know if you've ever met before." Mr. Jason and the Assistant Commissioner were introduced and greeted each other politely. It was surprising how, sooner or later, everybody came to this house. Another woman standing next to them turned and spoke now, looking towards Jason. "He's been frightening me with all his talk about Greenwich. He says we must stop these people, or the future is black for us." "Oh, Mr. Jason is good at frightening people," said the Assistant Commissioner, "but I'm sure he knows the true importance of what happened at Greenwich." Jason did not trust policemen, and he trusted this one less than most. What did the man mean with his talk of importance? He smiled when he answered, but his eyes were hard. "Perhaps we have problems in my country, because you let these people do what they like in your country." Jason got up to leave, and when he had turned away, the Assistant Commissioner got up too. "I thought you were going to stay and take Annie home," said the great lady. "I still have a little work to do. It may be important." The Assistant Commissioner went out into the street first, and Jason waited as long as possible before he did the same. But it was not long enough. The policeman was still standing there, and he started to walk along the street next to the other man. Jason was furious. What did he want? "Terrible weather," said Jason angrily. "But not too cold," replied the Assistant Commissioner. Then he added, "We've got a man called James helping us. I think that you know him." "What makes you say that?" "I don't. It's James who says that." "A line dog of some kind?" said Jason, surprised that the English police could be so clever. Now we can really begin to get rid of all foreign spies from this country. We can't catch them one by one. The only way is to make things difficult for the people who employ them. The arrest of this man, James, will show people how dangerous they are. Nobody will believe what a man like that says. I think that they will believe him when they hear the full story. But you're just making things easier for anyone who wants to call himself a revolutionary, cried Jason. Look, we have enough work to do catching the real revolutionaries. The last thing we want is to spend our time running after fake ones. I can't agree with you. What you want to do is terrible. We should be good Europeans, not just look after our own interests. Yes, said the Assistant Commissioner, except that you look at Europe from the other end. No foreign country can complain about our police this time. In less than 12 hours, we have identified the dead man, discovered who planned the bombing, and found out who had the idea in the first place. And we can go further, but we will stop inside our own country. So you know that this crime was planned abroad? Said Jason quickly. Well, in a way, said the Assistant Commissioner. But that's a detail. I'm talking to you because it's your country that complains most about our police. As you can see, we are not always so bad. Thank you for telling me, said Jason through his teeth. We know every anarchist here and where they are, said the Assistant Commissioner, sounding just like Inspector Heat. All we need to do now to make everything safe is to get rid of the secret agents. Jason had heard more than enough. Without a word, he stopped a passing cab, jumped inside, and drove off. The Assistant Commissioner looked at his watch and saw that it was only 10:30. Smiling to himself, he thought that he had had a very full evening. Chapter 9. Sophia and James. After Chief Inspector Heat left, James walked into the shop, wondering what to say to Sophia. She had not moved, and still had her hands over her face. When he spoke at last, her body began to shake. Sophia, you know that I didn't want anything to happen to Stevie. You're stupid, telling you so suddenly like that, eh? When Sophia did not reply, James thought he should leave her alone for a while. He went into the back room, where the food still lay on the table. Taking off his hat, he put it down lazily on the table. Then, taking hold of the carving knife, he cut himself a piece of bread and meat. He had not eaten all day. There was no food in Michaelis's cottage. When Michaelis sat down that morning to write his book, James had called up the stairs on taking this young man home for a day or two. He had not waited for an answer, but left the house quickly, followed by Stevie. Now that his busy day was over, James felt very empty. He ate standing up and tried to make Sophia talk to him. Come on, Sophia. We've got to think of tomorrow. You will have to be strong after I am taken away. Sophia's body was shaking more than ever. James felt sorry for his wife, but he really had no idea how she felt about Stevie. He had never understood much about Sophia. You should look at me when I'm talking to you, Sophia. Sophia's voice was flat and dead-sounding. I never want to look at you as long as I live. Sophia sat without moving or speaking, and James began to feel afraid. He tried to take hold of her wrist, but she suddenly jumped up and ran away from him into the kitchen. She had not looked at him once. James sat down on the empty chair with a dark, thoughtful look on his face. He was thinking about the future. What he saw was some time in prison, not too long, and then life abroad somewhere. He had been so near to success. But then the label on the coat was discovered. A small thing had spoiled the plan. It was like standing on a banana skin in the dark and breaking your leg. He sighed heavily, locked the shop door, and walked into the kitchen. Sophia was sitting at the table where Stevie usually sat to draw his circles. Her head was resting on her arms. James walked around the room like a large animal in a cage. Finally, he exploded. You don't know what a stupid, dangerous man I had to work for. We've been married for 7 years, and all that time I was in danger of losing my life. But I didn't say anything. Why should you have to worry? For 11 years, my life has been in danger every day because I tried to be helpful. Hundreds of revolutionaries with bombs in their pockets were caught because I told important people about them in time, and yet that pig made me go to the embassy at 11 o'clock in the morning. Think of the danger. I tell you, Sophia, I almost killed him, but then I thought of you. He couldn't go to the police either. You understand why, don't you? No, Dad, Sophia said in a flat voice. What are you talking about? James was tired and disappointed with his wife. She was really acting very strangely. But he tried to smile and said, You'll have to be strong, my girl. What's done is done. Go to bed now. You need to cry for a while. But Sophia could not cry. Stevie's terrible death had dried her eyes, and her heart had become like a piece of ice. She couldn't forget or forgive. On the white wall in front of her, she saw the past in pictures. She and Stevie in a dark bedroom, their violent father trying to push open the door, her mother cleaning, washing, and cooking day after day. Finally, she saw James and Stevie walking along the street away from her like father and son. That had been less than 2 weeks ago. James looked hopefully at his wife, who continued to stare at the white wall in front of her. He said, You'll have to be strong, Sophia, and look after the business while I'm away. It'll probably be for about 2 years. Then I'll let you know when it's time to sell everything. No one must know what you are going to do, especially not the comrades. I don't want a knife in my back as soon as I come out. He looked at his wife and added with a little worried laugh, I like you too much for that. When Sophia heard these words, a little color came into her white face. She got up suddenly and went towards the stairs. James, watching her go, felt disappointed. Sophia never showed her feelings much, but surely this was different. Why couldn't she be nice to him? He sighed and cut himself another piece of meat. When Sophia came downstairs again, she was dressed in her coat and a hat with a black veil that covered her face. James tried not to seem angry. It's 8:20, Sophia. Your mother will be in bed before you get there. This is the kind of news that can wait. In fact, Sophia had simply wanted to run away, to get out of the house. She was a free woman now, but what was she going to do now that she was free? She sat down suddenly on the nearest chair, looking like a visitor who had come to visit for just a short while. Her silence made James feel angrier. Now look, Sophia, he said. Your place is here this evening. Take that hat off. I can't let you go out tonight. No, he can't let me go. Of course he can't, thought Sophia. Now that he has murdered Stevie, he will never let me go. He will want to keep me forever. James finally shouted furiously at her. Can't you say something? You really know how to make a man angry. Oh yes, I know your silences. I've seen them before today. But I've had enough. To begin with, take this thing off. I can't tell if I'm talking to a woman or a dummy. He stepped forward and pulled off the veil. That's better. Look, Sophia, I tried to find someone else to do the job, but there was no one. Don't you understand? I'm not a murderer. It was an accident. He tripped over the root of a tree, and it's your doing as much as mine. You asked me to take the boy out again and again. Don't make any mistake about it. You killed that boy as much as I did. Sophia had listened to these words in silence and without moving. Now she stood up like someone at the end of a visit and went towards her husband with one arm held out. Her veil had fallen down on one side of her face, but James had moved away to the sofa without waiting to see his wife's face. He threw himself down heavily. One side of his open coat was lying partly on the ground. All he wanted was to go to sleep. As he made himself comfortable, he said, I wish that I had never seen Greenwich Park or anything like it. As these words reached Sophia, her eyes seemed to grow larger. A park. That's where her brother had been killed. She let herself see the destruction. All the leaves and pieces of his body among the small stones. They had picked him up with a shovel. She closed her eyes and saw everything flying into the air like a firework, then falling to the ground again. Stevie's head was the last thing to fall. For a minute, it hung in the air like the last star of an exploding firework, and slowly it disappeared. At last, she opened her eyes. Her face had changed. It was clear that she had decided to do something. But James, lying on the sofa, had noticed nothing. "Sophia?" he said in a low voice. "Come here." "Yes," answered Sophia, the free woman, in a soft, low voice. She knew what she had to do now. From where she stood, James's head and shoulders were hidden by the high side of the sofa. She kept her eyes fixed on his feet. James moved a little on the sofa to make room for his wife. Why? Sophia came forward, and as she passed the table, she silently took the carving knife in her hand. James, lying on his back, saw on the wall the moving shadow of an arm and a hand holding a huge knife. It moved slowly enough for him to recognize the arm and the knife. His wife had gone mad. He had no time to move at all. Before he could do anything, the knife was already in his chest. After whispering the word, "Don't," James died. Sophia let go of the knife and sighed deeply. She had killed her husband. The room seemed to move strangely around her, but she was calm. Resting against the sofa, she was as still as her husband's body. After a while, she lifted her head and looked slowly at the clock on the wall. She could hear a ticking sound, but the clock had never ticked like that before. Tick, tick, tick. What was it? Her eyes traveled slowly down James's body until they arrived at the knife in his chest. Dark drops of blood were falling faster and faster onto the floor with the sound of a crazy clock. Blood! Sophia cried out and ran to the door. The table was in her way, and she pushed it violently with both hands. The big plate with the meat on it fell heavily to the floor, taking with it James's hat. Then everything became still. At the door, Sophia had stopped. She was staring at the round hat lying in the middle of the floor. It was rocking slowly from side to side. Chapter 10. Tom Conrad. Sophia was different. Her calmness had left her, and she was afraid. With shaking hands, she tried to fix the veil that had fallen from her face. Her mind was filled with a terrible picture of herself hanging by the neck, for that is what the Lord did to murderers. She could not let that happen to her. She must go at once to the river and throw herself off a bridge. Time seemed to stand still as she moved slowly across the shop and almost fell into the street. It was like falling into water, like jumping to your death in a sea of fog. Each gas lamp had a little half circle of fog around it, and she felt it in her hair and all over her face. The cabs and the horses were gone, and in the black street, the window of the little restaurant was a square of blood light. Sophia, all alone in the world, managed to get past the lighted window, but then felt too tired to continue. Falling forwards again, she suddenly felt someone's hands holding her. She looked up into a face, a man's face with fair hair, and said in surprise, "Mr. Conrad." "Mrs. James," said Conrad, "what are you doing here?" He put his arm around her, and to his surprise, she did not move away. "Were you coming to the shop?" she asked. "Yes," answered Conrad. "As soon as I read the paper." "I was coming to look for you," said Sophia. "I am in trouble." "I know," said Conrad, thinking quickly. "I met a man who explained everything. Then I came straight to you. You know how I've always felt about you. But you were always so unfriendly." "Unfriendly? I was a married woman. I gave 7 years of my life to him, and he was a devil, Tom." "Tom?" Conrad could not believe his luck. Only very good friends called him by that name. Sophia held him by both arms as they stood in the foggy darkness and loneliness of Brett Street. "I didn't know," Conrad stuttered, "but I understand now. You unhappy, brave woman. Oh, but he is dead now. You know that he is dead." "You know what I had to do," cried Sophia. Conrad began to wonder why Sophia was behaving so strangely. "How did you first hear about it?" he asked. "From Chief Inspector Heat, in Namware too. But he didn't do anything. The police were on that man's side. A foreign man came too. He was one of those embassy people. Don't ask me about it, please." "All right, I won't," said Conrad kindly. Police? Embassy? What was all this about? He decided not to think too much about it. After all, he had the woman here, and she was throwing herself at him. That was the important thing. Now she was talking about escaping, about going abroad. He said quickly, "To be honest, my dear, I haven't enough money to help you. We revolutionaries are not rich, you know." "But I've money, Tom." He gave it to me, all of it. All of it. "In that case, we are saved," said Conrad slowly. He remembered that there was a boat that left Southampton at midnight. They could catch the 10:30 train. The train leaves from Waterloo Station. We have plenty of time. Just a minute. Where are you going?" Sophia was trying to pull him back into Brett Street again. The shop door was ajar. "I forgot to shut it," she whispered, suddenly very afraid. Conrad almost said, "It doesn't matter. Leave it." But perhaps she had left the money in a cupboard. He let Sophia pull him towards the shop entrance. "There's a light on in the back room." "I forgot it." "Go and put it out, Tom." "Where's all that money?" "I've got it." "Quick, go in and put out the light." She took him by the shoulders and pushed him. Conrad went through the dark shop towards the back room. As he took hold of the door handle, he looked through the glass and saw James lying quietly on the sofa. For a long moment he stared, feeling sick and frightened. Was this a game of some kind? Were the police waiting for him? But then he saw the hat lying on the floor. His eyes travelled from there to the table with the broken plate, and back again to James. The man's eyes were not fully closed, and he seemed to be looking at something in his chest. Conrad's eyes finally rested on the handle of the carving knife. He turned quickly away from the door and was violently sick. Suddenly, Sophia was there. "Did you do this by yourself?" asked Conrad. "Yes," she whispered. "Don't let them hang me, Tom. Take me out of the country. Help me. Protect me. He killed my boy, Tom Knight. He took him from me, my good and loving boy, and he killed him." Joseph Conrad suddenly realized what had really happened in the Greenwich bombing. The person who had died in the park was her brother, that boy who always sat drawing circles. And now he, Conrad, was here with his sister, who was mad too. Sophia was shouting now, "Save me, Tom." She fell onto the floor and put her arms around his legs. "Get up," said Conrad, who had gone very white. He was terrified, but he spoke almost calmly. "Let's get out, or we will miss the train." Sophia followed him obediently into the street. The cracked bell rang like a warning to James that his wife had left for the last time with his friend. In the cab, Conrad tried to stay calm as he explained the plan to Sophia. "When we arrive, I will get the tickets and give yours to you as I pass you. Go to the waiting room and come out 10 minutes before the train leaves. Get on the train first, and I will get on after you. Do you understand, my dear?" "Yes, Tom," said Sophia, ice cold with fear. "I ought to have the money now to get the tickets." Sophia put her hand inside her dress and took out the wallet full of banknotes. At the station, Sophia went into the waiting room, her ticket in her hand. When it was time, she walked with a straight back towards the train, her face white under the black veil. Conrad followed her onto the train. "In here," he said, pushing her into an empty compartment. Sophia lifted her veil. Her eyes were huge and staring like two black holes. Conrad looked into them and thought of Lombroso's description of criminal types. There was no doubt about it. Those eyes, that nose. The woman had the face of a murderer. When he spoke, his voice shook a little. "He was an extraordinary boy, your brother. A perfect type, in a way." "He was," she whispered softly. "You took a lot of notice of him, Tom. I loved you for it." "You are very like him," said Conrad uncomfortably, waiting for the train to leave. These words were not spoken very kindly, but they were too much for Sophia. She began to cry at last. Conrad entered the compartment and quickly closed the door. The train did not leave for another 8 minutes, and for 3 of these, Sophia cried without stopping. Then she became a little calmer and tried to speak to the man who had saved her. "Oh, Tom, I wanted to die, but when you came... Oh, Tom, I will live all my days for you. Don't spoil things. Go into the other corner of the compartment away from the window, said Conrad. He watched her carefully as she went and sat down again, crying even more violently than before. At last he felt the train beginning to move. A strange, wild look came over his face. Sophia heard and felt nothing. As the train was pulling away and beginning to go faster, Conrad crossed the compartment quickly, opened the door, and jumped out. He turned over again and again like a shot rabbit. When he stood up, he was shaking and white-faced, but very calm. He explained to the excited crowd around him that his wife had gone to see her dying mother in Brittany, and that he had not realized the train was moving because he was so worried about her. "But I don't think I'll try that again," he said, smiling at the people around him. After giving them some coins from his pocket, he walked out of the station. Outside, Conrad walked and walked. By the river, he stood looking at the black, silent water for a long time. The big clock above his head told him that it was 12:30. All night he walked through the sleeping city in the fog. He walked down empty streets between lines of gas lamps and shadowy houses that were all the same. He walked through squares and down streets with unknown names where people lived forgotten lives. He walked, but saw nothing. At last he went up to a small grey house, took a key from his pocket, and opened the front door. Inside, he threw himself onto the bed fully dressed and lay, without moving for a quarter of an hour. Then he sat up suddenly and pulled his knees towards his chest. When the first light of day came, he was still sitting in the same way, staring in front of him. But when the late sun entered his room, he fell back onto the bed and closed his eyes. Finally, Joseph Conrad slept in the sunlight. At a table near the window, Conrad sat with his head between his hands. He was in the professor's room, listening to the professor telling him about his recent visit to Michaelis's house. He didn't know anything about James's death, of course. He lives on carrots and milk, dreaming of a world like a nice big hospital, with gardens and flowers, where the strong people look after the weak ones. What a stupid idea. The weak, the ones who make all the problems in the world. I tell you, the weak and the stupid must disappear. That is the only way we can change things, said Conrad in a low voice. And what's left? Me? If I'm strong enough? Just give me time. Ah, all those people, too stupid to feel fear, the professor remarked as he pulled on his worn-out boots. Sometimes I feel they have the whole world on their side. Come, have a beer with me, he offered. Beer. Let's drink and be merry, eh? Conrad replied, attempting a smile. The professor chuckled. What's the matter with you, Conrad? You look glum, wanting to drink with me. What's happened to all your women, eh? Tell me, has one of them ever killed herself for you? That's what really matters. Blood and death. Look at history. Go to hell, Conrad retorted bitterly. You're just like everyone else. You just want more time. The man who can give you 10 more years will be your master. No, I have no masters, replied the professor defiantly. Later, in the bar across the street, the professor clinked glasses with Conrad and said, Let's drink to destruction. Conrad pulled a newspaper out of his pocket. Anything in the paper? Asked the professor. Conrad hesitated, a moment of fear crossing his face. No, nothing. It's 10 days old. I forgot to throw it away. But he didn't discard it now. The article's words echoed in his mind. Mysterious death of lady passenger on cross-channel boat. Conrad felt a chill of fear. He alone knew the truth, the story behind the woman in black, staring out to sea, consumed by some terrible anguish. He knew the fear etched in that pale face, the struggle between despair and the will to live. At 5 in the morning, she had vanished from the boat. A wedding ring found on her seat bore an inscription, 24th of June, 1879. Growing weary of Conrad's silence, the professor rose to leave. Stay, Conrad urged hastily. Tell me, what do you know of madness and despair? They don't exist. The world is weak. You are weak. James was weak, and the police murdered him. Madness and despair. Give me those, and I'll move the world. Conrad, you're useless. Always chasing after women. Even with all this supposed money, you're not any wiser. Sitting there like a dummy. Goodbye. Conrad was left alone. He waited briefly, then rose and headed for the door. The words of the newspaper article echoed in his mind. Mysterious death. I'm very ill, he thought. He stepped out into the street, walking as he had walked that night over a week ago, seeing nothing, hearing nothing. Elsewhere in the city, the professor walked too, avoiding the crowds of people he despised. He had no future either, but he didn't care. He believed in his strength, in his ability to change the world with madness and despair. Small and inconsequential, he moved through the bustling streets,